I've always hated the night. Not for any particular reason, really. It's just the quiet, the stillness. It unnerves me. Maybe it's because I'm a city boy at heart, where the hum of traffic and the distant blare of sirens create a comforting white noise that lulls you to sleep. But 3 years ago, after I lost my job in the city, I found myself on the outskirts of a small, middle-of-nowhere town in Kansas. It was a fresh start, or at least that's what I kept telling myself. The house was cheap. Too cheap. But it was all that I could afford. It sat on the edge of a massive cornfield that stretched as far as the eye could see. The nearest neighbor was miles away, and the nights were suffocatingly quiet. It was just me, the creaking old house, and the endless rows of corn. At first, it wasn't so bad. The isolation had a kind of charm to it. I'd spend my days fixing up the house, trying to ignore the creeping sense of unease that settled in as the sun dipped below the horizon. But as the weeks turned into months, the nights started to really get to me. The silence seemed to press in on me, making it hard to breathe, hard to think. It was like the darkness was alive, watching me, waiting for something. It started with small things I could easily dismiss. The sound of footsteps outside of my window at night, the feeling of being watched when I was out going to check on the mail. Shadows didn't quite match the shapes of the trees. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just my imagination, but deep down, I knew something was wrong. One night, it was worse. I woke up around 3 a.m., the house deathly silent. I was drenched in sweat, my heart was pounding, though I didn't know why. There hadn't been a sound, not even a creak from the old floorboards, but something had yanked me out of the sleep. Some primal instinct screaming that I wasn't alone. I sat up in bed, straining to hear anything at all, but the silence was so complete. It was like being trapped in a vacuum. Then I noticed it, an odd, faint light flickering through the gaps in the curtains. It was a sickly, pale blue, unlike anything I'd ever seen before. It wasn't the moon, it wasn't a car's headlights. My nearest neighbor was miles away. It was something else. It was wrong. I slipped out of bed, my skin crawling with dread. Slowly, I moved towards the window, every step a battle against the fear that had seized my muscles. My hands trembled as I parted the curtains just enough to peek outside. What I saw made my breath catch in my throat. Hovering above the cornfield was a massive circular object. Its surface smooth and almost metallic, but with an ethereal glow. The pale blue light emitted from it, casting an eerie glow over the cornfield. It was completely silent, not even the hum of an engine. Just there, hovering, seeming to be watching. Panic surged through me. I backed away from the window. My heart was racing, pounding out of my chest. This couldn't be real. I must be dreaming. I pinched myself. I rubbed my eyes, but the light would not go away. It was still there, bleeding in through the blinds. But the cold sweat on my skin, the pounding of my heart, the taste of fear in my mouth. This was real. This was terrifyingly real. I had to get out of there. I didn't know what this thing was, but every instinct screamed that I was in danger. I grabbed my phone, but the screen was dead. No signal, no power. The lights in the house had gone out too, leaving me in complete darkness, save for the faint glow from the window. I stumbled through the house, heading for the front door. My only thought was to get to my car, to drive as far away from that place as possible, But as I reached the door, I froze. The light had changed. It wasn't just outside anymore. It was seeping through the walls, the ceiling, the floor. It was everywhere. A bright, blinding blue that filled the room, disorienting me. I turned back towards the living room, my eyes struggling to adjust to the brightness, but I was no longer alone. They were there. 3 figures stood in the center of the room, silhouetted by the blue light. They were tall, unnaturally so, with spindly limbs and elongated heads. Their eyes were large, black, reflecting the light in a way that made them seem bottomless, soulless. They had no mouths, no noses, just those eyes that bored into me, stripping away every layer of defense I had. I wanted to scream, to run, but I couldn't move. My body was frozen in place, paralyzed by fear or something else. I tried to will my legs to move, but they refused to obey. I was trapped, helpless, and they were coming closer. The largest of the 3 reached out a hand, its fingers impossibly long and thin, tipped with what looked like tiny needles. I watched in horror as the hand moved closer to my face, those needle-like fingers extending towards my eye. I could feel the pressure building in my skull as a searing pain, as if my brain was being torn apart. Then, everything went dark. When I woke up, I was lying on the floor. The blue light was gone, the room dark and silent once more. My body ached, every joint screaming in protest as I tried to move. My head throbbed with a dull, persistent pain, and my mouth was dry, like I hadn't had water in days. I dragged myself up, my mind spinning with questions and fear. What had happened? Where had they gone? My eyes fell on my arms and I gasped. Tiny circular marks dotted my skin, like the puncture wounds from a syringe. They were everywhere. My arms, my legs, even my neck. I touched one, wincing at the tenderness. I stumbled to the bathroom, needing to see the damage to understand what had been done to me. The light flickered as I flipped the switch, revealing my reflection in the cracked mirror. I looked like a corpse, pale, hollow-eyed, with those strange marks covering my skin, but it was my eyes that terrified me the most. They weren't mine. They were darker, too dark, and there was something else, something behind them that wasn't me. I leaned closer to the mirror, and that's when I saw it, a flash of blue, deep within my pupils. It was there, something alien, something that didn't belong. I backed away, shaking my head in denial and fear. This couldn't be happening. I had to get out of there. I had to find help, someone who could make sense of this nightmare. But as I turned to leave, a wave of dizziness washed over me, sending me crashing to the floor. The last thing I remember before everything went black again was the sound of footsteps. Those same, soft, deliberate footsteps that had haunted my nights. But this time, they weren't outside. They were inside, coming closer, and there was nothing I could do. I've lived in this quiet Nebraska town my whole life. The kind of place where everyone knows your name and what time you go to bed. Most folks here are farmers, including myself. I inherited the family farm from my father when he passed away 5 years ago. And since then, I've been living in this house with just my dog Rex and the endless fields of corn for company. The peace and routine of farm life had always been a comfort to me. Until that night, the night everything changed. It was late October, just after the harvest. The days had started growing shorter and the nights were getting colder. I remember it was a Friday because I had just finished up a long week and was looking forward to spending the weekend doing nothing but sitting on the porch with Rex, sipping a cold beer, and watching the sunset over the cornfields. But that night, the sunset wasn't like the others. It started around 9 p.m. Rex and I were out in the fields checking on some of the equipment had left out earlier in the day. The moon was full, casting an eerie silver light over the landscape, making the dried corn stalks look like ghostly figures swaying in the breeze. Suddenly, Rex started growling, low and menacingly. His hackles were up, and he was staring into the distance towards the far end of the field, where the trees lined the horizon. I followed his gaze and saw something that made my heart skip a beat. There, just above the treetops, were 3 lights. They were hovering, silent and still, like they were watching us. The lights were a deep, unnatural blue, and they pulsated slowly, almost like they were breathing. I couldn't tear my eyes away from them. They weren't like any aircraft lights I had ever seen before. No planes, no helicopters, nothing like that had ever flown over this part of the country. I stood frozen, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The lights didn't move at first, just hung there in the sky. Then, without warning, they shot towards us, faster than anything I'd ever seen, and stopped just above the cornfield, maybe 50 feet from where I stood. Rex barked ferociously, but I couldn't move. My feet felt like they were glued to the ground. The lights hovered there for what felt like hours, but was probably only a few minutes. The air was thick, charged with a kind of electricity that made my skin prickle. The blue glow cast strange shadows on the ground, making the cornfield look like a different world, an alien landscape. And then, as suddenly as they had appeared, the lights changed. They merged into one, growing brighter and brighter, until it was almost blinding. That's when I heard the sound. A low, humming noise, like a swarm of bees, but much deeper, vibrating in my chest. It was coming from the light, which was now so bright I had to shield my eyes. The humming grew louder, almost unbearable, and just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, everything was silent. I don't remember falling to the ground, but when I opened my eyes, I was lying in the middle of the cornfield, flat on my back. The lights were gone, and the night was quiet again. Too quiet. Rex was nowhere to be seen, and the only sound was the rustling of the corn in the wind. My head was pounding, and my mouth was dry. I felt disoriented, like I'd been hit in the head. Slowly, I got to my feet and looked around. The field was empty, no signs of the light or Rex. I called out for him, but there was no response. Panic started to set in as I stumbled through the cornfield calling his name. The cornstalk seemed to close in around me, the darkness pressing in from all sides. My flashlight, which I had dropped, flickered weakly as I picked it up, casting erratic beams of light over the swaying corn. I didn't know how long I wandered through the field, but eventually, I found myself back at the house. The porch light was on, and everything looked normal, but I knew it wasn't. Something had happened out there in the field, something I couldn't explain. I spent the next few hours searching for Rex, but he was gone, vanished. I checked every inch of the farm, but there was no trace of him. Exhausted and terrified, I finally collapsed on the couch, unable to shake the feeling that I was being watched. The next morning, I woke up to find strange marks on my arms and legs. Tiny, perfectly round circles, like puncture wounds. But they didn't hurt. They were just there, as if someone or something had done something to me while I was unconscious. My first thought was to go to the doctor, but something inside of me told me not to. I didn't want to explain what had happened. I didn't want to be labeled as crazy. The days that followed were a blur. I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat. The farm work piled up, but I didn't care. All I could think about were those lights and what had happened to Rex. I started seeing things out of the corner of my eye. Flashes of blue light, shadows that moved in a way that they shouldn't move. At night, I would wake up drenched in sweat, convinced that the lights were outside of my window waiting for me. One night, about a week after the incident, I heard something outside of the house. It was a faint scratching noise. It sounded like something was trying to get in through the front door. My heart pounded in my chest as I grabbed the shotgun I kept next to the door and crept towards the window. The moonlight cast long shadows across the yard, and for a moment I thought I saw something moving near the barn. I swallowed hard and opened the door, stepping out into the cold night air. The scratching stopped, but I knew something was out there. I could feel it. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness as I walked towards the barn, the shotgun heavy in my hands. The cornfield loomed in the distance, a dark mass against the sky. When I reached the barn, I paused, listening. There was a rustling sound coming from inside, like something was moving around amongst the hay bales. I raised the shotgun, my finger trembling on the trigger, and kicked the door open. The barn was dimly lit by the moonlight streaming in through the gaps in the walls. I scanned the shadows with my flashlight, but there was nothing. Just the hay and old tools hanging on the walls. My heart was racing as I took a step inside, trying to convince myself that it was just a raccoon or a stray cat that had gotten in. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it. A flash of movement. Something darted through the shadows near the back of the barn. I swung the flashlight around, but I only caught a glimpse, a tall, thin silhouette with limbs that seemed too long and a head that was too large, slipping out through the barn door on the other side. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The figure I'd seen was nothing like a human, nothing like any animal I knew. It was the stuff of nightmares, its form unmistakably alien. Every story I'd ever heard about gray aliens flashed through my mind. Their bulbous heads, large black, dead eyes, and spindly bodies. I wasn't dealing with something from this world. Without thinking, I ran back to the house, nearly tripping over my own feet. My mind was racing. I locked every door and window, the shotgun still clutched tightly in my hands. They weren't going to take me without a fight. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know how to protect myself from something like that, but I had to try. All I knew is that they were real, and they were here. Hours passed in silence. I sat in the living room, the shotgun across my lap, waiting for something to happen. My heart pounded with every creak of the house, every whisper of the wind, but nothing came. Just when I began to think that maybe they had left, I heard it. The humming. It was back. It started low. It was almost imperceptible, but it grew louder and louder until it filled the entire house. The lights outside flickered and the humming intensified. I could see shadows moving past the window, tall, thin figures with large heads and black, soulless eyes. My hand shook as I gripped the shotgun, my mind screaming at me to do something, anything. Then, in an instant, they were inside. The door to the living room creaked open, and 3 of them stepped in, their movements slow and deliberate. They were just as I had imagined, short, with pale, almost translucent skin and large black eyes that reflected no light. They moved in unison, their gaze fixed on me as they approached. My survival instincts kicked in, and I fired the shotgun. The blast echoed through the house, and one of the aliens staggered back, a dark, viscous fluid oozing from his chest. It fell to the floor, twitching, while the others remained eerily calm. Before I could react, a blinding beam of light shot from one of the aliens, striking me in the chest. The gun slipped from my hands, clattering to the floor as my muscles seized up, paralyzed by the energy coursing through my body. I couldn't move, I couldn't scream, I was completely at their mercy. The two remaining aliens moved towards me, their faces expressionless, unfeeling, as they watched me struggle. I felt myself being lifted off the ground, weightless. As the beam of light carried me through the air, my vision blurred. As I was pulled through the house, out the door, into the night sky, the last thing I saw was the blue lights hovering above the farm, growing brighter and brighter as I was pulled towards them. My body was numb, my mind filled with an overwhelming sense of dread. I knew I wasn't coming back. I don't know what happened after that. Maybe I was taken to their ship, experimented on like some lab rat. Maybe they erased my memories, left me in a field somewhere, a shell of a man I used to be. Or maybe, just maybe, I never left that night. Maybe my body is still out there lying in the cornfield, waiting to be found. All I know is that they are real. They're out there, watching, waiting, and one day, they will come for you too. I've always been a night owl. There's something about the quiet of the late hours that makes me feel alive. Like I'm the only person awake in the world. It's when I do my best work. Hunched over my desk, the glow of a computer screen casting long shadows across my small studio apartment. It's right for me. My place was in the heart of the city, surrounded by the constant hum of traffic and distant chatter of nightlife. But none of that really bothered me. I liked the noise. It kept me grounded. It reminded me that I wasn't alone. That night was no different. I had just settled into my usual routine, the clock ticking past 2 a.m. when I first noticed that something was off. It started as a faint buzz, barely noticeable, over the sound of the city, but it quickly grew louder, more insistent. It was demanding my attention. I frowned, lifted my head from the screen, trying to pinpoint the source. It was coming from outside, somewhere in the street below. I got up and moved to the window, pulling aside the heavy curtains to peer down into the darkened street, not expecting to see anything. At first, everything looked normal. The streetlights cast pools of yellow light on the pavement, and a few cars were parked along the curb, but then I saw it. A strange, flickering light hovering above one of the buildings across the street. The light was an eerie green, pulsing in a slow, rhythmic pattern. It wasn't a spotlight or anything I'd ever seen before. It just kind of hung there in the air, like it was watching, waiting. My skin prickled with unease as I stared at it, captivated, unable to look away. Then, as suddenly as it appeared, the light shot upwards and disappeared into the sky. I blinked and chuckled, wondering if I'd imagined the whole thing. But the buzzing in my ears was somehow still there. It was more intense now, almost painful. I backed away from the window, my heart racing for reasons I couldn't explain. I put my headphones on and tried listening to music, but even that couldn't drown out the buzzing. It almost seemed to supersede the music that I was playing. I pulled off my headphones. I tried to shake it off, convincing myself it was just a trick of the light. Maybe some weird reflection, but the feelings of unease clung to me. Like a shadow I couldn't escape. I returned to my desk trying to focus on my work, but the buzzing wouldn't stop. It grew louder, more oppressive, until I could barely think straight. I slammed my laptop shut. Frustration boiling over. I needed to step out for a minute. I needed to get out of that apartment, clear my head, get some fresh air. The thought of stepping out into the cool night air was suddenly so appealing, so I grabbed my jacket and I headed for the door. The hallway outside of my apartment was dark and silent, the flickering overhead light casting a dim glow. I hesitated for a moment, the buzzing in my ears making me feel unsteady on my feet, almost as if I was drunk. But I shook it off and made my way down the stairs. The building was old, with creaking wooden steps and narrow hallways, but I'd never felt uneasy like this before. Tonight was different. Tonight, the darkness seemed to press in on me, making it almost hard to breathe. There was a palpable pressure in the air. When I finally reached the lobby, I paused, my hand on the door handle. I was about to step outside. I could see the street outside, empty and still, the same as it had been from my window, but something stopped me from going through the door. The buzzing in my ears grew louder, almost deafening, and I felt it. Sudden, overwhelming sense of dread. Before I could react, the lights in the lobby flickered and went out, plunging me into complete darkness. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The only sound was the buzzing. Now so intense, it felt like it was coming from inside my own head. And then I saw it. There was a figure, barely visible in the darkness, standing in the middle of the lobby. It was tall, unnaturally so, with long, thin limbs that seemed to stretch outwards, merging with the shadows. Its head was large, with eyes that glowed a sickly green, the same color as the light I had seen earlier. Then, slowly, it began to move towards me, its steps silent and deliberate. The closer it got, the more I could feel its presence, a cold, overwhelming force that seemed to drain the life out of everything around it, drain the life out of me. The buzzing in my ears reached a fever pitch, making my head throb with pain. I couldn't move. I tried to back away, but my feet wouldn't obey. I was rooted in that spot. I was stuck, forced to watch as the figure approached. It stopped just a few feet away from me, its towering form looming over me like a shadow. Those eyes, those terrible eyes, bore into me, and I felt a strange sensation, like my mind was being pulled apart, examined. Images flashed before my eyes, memories, thoughts, fears, things I hadn't thought about in years. It was as if that figure was sifting through my mind, searching for something, and I was powerless to stop it. The pain in my head grew unbearable, and I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to block out the sensation, but it was no use. The figure was inside my mind now, invading every part of me. I could feel it probing, digging deeper and deeper until it found what it was looking for, and then, as quickly as it had begun, it stopped. The buzzing in my ears faded, and the pain in my head lessened. I opened my eyes, grasping for breath, but the figure was gone. The lobby was still dark, but the oppressive weight in the air had lifted. I stumbled backwards, my legs finally obeying me, and I fell against the door, my heart racing. For a moment, I just stood there, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Had it been real? A hallucination brought on by stress and lack of sleep? But the memories, they were too vivid, too raw to dismiss as a mere dream. I needed to get out of there. Without thinking, I pushed the door open and stepped out into the street. The cool night air hit me like a shock. I took a deep, gulping breath, trying to steady myself. The street was still empty, dead, just as I had seen it from my window. This was so unnatural. The lights in the surrounding buildings were all out. It was like the city was vacant. I was the only one on planet Earth. The only sound was the distant hum of the city, but it was far off. The buzzing in my ears was gone, replaced by a deep, unsettling silence. I looked up at the sky, half expecting to see the strange green light again, but there was nothing, just stars twinkling innocently above, as if nothing had happened. I didn't know what to do, where to go. My apartment no longer felt safe, but I couldn't just stand there in the middle of the street. My mind raced, trying to come up with a plan, but all I could think about was those eyes, those terrible green eyes. Suddenly I felt a presence behind me, a cold, familiar force that made my blood freeze. I turned slowly, my heart in my throat, and saw the figure standing at the end of the street watching me. It hadn't gone away, it had followed me. Panic surged through me, and I turned and ran, my feet pounding against the pavement. I didn't know where I was going, only that I needed to get away from that thing. But no matter how fast I ran, I could feel the figure behind me keeping pace, its eyes boring into the back of my head. I rounded a corner, nearly tripping over my own feet, and found myself in an alleyway. It was a dead end. I skidded to a stop, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I was trapped. The figure stepped into the alley, its form barely visible in the darkness. I pressed myself against the wall. My mind was racing, trying to figure a way out. Could I climb the wall? Could I do anything? Were there any holes in the wall? But there was nothing. There was no escape. The figure moved closer, its steps slow and deliberate, until it was standing just a few feet away from me. I could feel its presence again, cold and overwhelming, pressing down on me like a weight. My head throbbed with pain. I squeezed my eyes shut, bracing myself for the invasion I knew was coming. But this time it was different. The figure didn't probe my mind, didn't sift through my memories. Instead, it simply stood there. Its eyes locked on mine. I could feel its gaze, cold and calculating, as if it was waiting for something. And then, without warning, it reached out a hand. A long, spindly limb that seemed to stretch impossibly far and touched my forehead. The pain was immediate and excruciating. My vision blurred, and I felt my knees give out beneath me. The world around me seemed to dissolve. The alleyway, the city, everything faded into darkness. The only thing that remained was the figure, its eyes burning into me. And then everything went black. When I woke up, I was lying on the cold pavement, the sky above starting to lighten with the first hints of dawn. The figure was gone, and the buzzing in my ears had finally stopped. But I knew, deep down, that it wasn't over. It would come back, and next time, I might not be so lucky. As I stumbled to my feet, I realized something else. The city was waking up. The sounds of traffic and people began to fill the air. The world returning to normal, but for me, nothing would ever be normal again.